preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
It's not in the fall catalog. For those of you who are subscribers, you should have received or will shortly receive a ticket to the March 24th evening with Anne Bursby. If you don't get that ticket in a timely fashion in the next week or 10 days, give the Brockton Center a call. They have been mailed. Have some of you received them? Yes. Yeah. Oh, very good. There's coffee and dessert. Please help yourselves. After our program, books will be for sale, and it's my pleasure now to turn the evening over to Dr. Krebs.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming on this very, very cold night. Let me just say a few words about Jonathan Wilson. He was born in London, lived in Jerusalem, and since 1976, I believe, living in the United States, correct me if I'm wrong, and is currently chair of the English department at Tufts. He has written 2 other works of fiction and 2 critical works on Sol Bellow. His short stories and essays have also appeared in The New Yorker, the New York Times Book Review, The Forward, and various other journals. Welcome, Jonathan Wilson.
Thanks for having me. Whoa. Serious Mike.
Yes. With this novel, we are in Palestine during the period of the British Mandate, 1924, I think. Following the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, the British were given a mandate by the League of Nations to administer a large portion of the Middle East, along with France, which governed Iraq, Syria, and other areas. In Palestine, Britain had a rather awkward situation because it had to balance the interests of the Arabs and of the Yishuv, the Jewish settlement or the Jewish population, while, of course, looking after its own interests as well. So, Jonathan, can you tell us something about the British administration of institutions in Palestine? I'm particularly interested, for instance, in the police because of one of our protagonists' relationship with his British counterpart, he being the Jewish policeman. So fill us in a little bit, if you would, about the administration, Britain's administration of Palestine during the Mandate.
Well, the thing that interested me was the sort of mix of the administration, in the sense that if you look at the people who I've got in the novel who've come out there, Robert Kirsch, who's a young English Jew, with very little interest in Palestine or in Zionism, has really gone out to Palestine on a kind of adventure. And he's had something of a sort of upper-class education in England. So there's one model, a British Jew who really is more British than Jewish, who's out there as part of the administration. One of the fascinating things was that we'd already had the sort of Balfour Declaration. So the Brits have come out saying, okay, we're in favor of supporting a Jewish homeland in Palestine. But on the other hand, there are quite powerful forces in the British government, particularly in the Foreign Office and the Colonial Office, who are Arabists, who are really opposed to the Balfour Declaration. Churchill was one of the supporters, by the way, when he was in the Colonial Office. So you have a situation where the British have decided to send out as their administrators a number of Jews. After all, the High Commissioner, Sir Herbert Samuel, is a Jew. But not all of those Jews are pro-Zionist. Similarly, you have in the administration a number of Brits who are not Jewish, some of whom are pro-Zionist and some of whom are not. Among the police, you have British Jews, British non-Jews, and the local constabulary, which is Palestinian Arabs and Palestinian Jews. So there's a real sort of mix, merge, mishmash and clash of thinking and ideas and allegiances. And obviously that's something that that fascinated me for all kinds of reasons in the novel.
So there must have been, from an administrative point of view, I would think that there must have been some tension among these various factions. How did that play itself out?
Well,
from a point of view of actually governing the territory.
Well, I think that it occurred to me after the novel had come out, and in terms of sort of recent history, it struck me that perhaps the model for what was happening is quite similar to, let's say, if you are an Arab American administrator in the United States forces in Iraq.
Right.
In other words, it seems to me probably a very difficult position to be in. Probably the local groups, the Shiites and the Sunni Muslims are suspicious of you, think you're acting like an American, not like an Arab, and so on. And that's rather what it was like for a number of the administrators, and particularly, certainly for the British Jews in the administration, who were regarded with suspicion by both the local Arab population and the local Jewish population. So somebody like Robert Kirsch in my novel, the local Jews are saying to him, well, why are you acting like a Brit? You're Jewish. Why aren't you sympathizing with us? And the Arabs are saying, well, you're a Jew. We know you're really rooting for them. So it's this kind of ambiguity. And Kirsch, as I imagine some of the others, get caught with the sort of illusion of trying to, like the Americans now in Iraq, if you like, of trying to sort of play fair. Now, of course, the British, in a bigger picture, certainly have their own reasons for being in Palestine, which are, they're not exactly disingenuous. They've got their own geopolitical reasons for wanting to run the show there. But I was interested in the novel in the fate of more ordinary individuals who get pushed and shoved by big history, who maybe take on a situation that is larger than they can handle, and suddenly find themselves put on the spot, as happens to Kirsch.
Good, thank you. Well, returning to the novel. So it deals with a British Jewish painter by the name of Mark Bloomberg, who was brought to Palestine by a Zionist organization in London to do a series of paintings depicting and inspiring Jewish pioneers. And he is, of course, rather uncomfortable with the commercial aspects of this project because he feels that it's a betrayal of some of his artistic goals and his style. Although he finds that once he gets to Jerusalem, he finds that he's painting in a much more realistic style than was his custom. His wife is a Gentile American. So in both respects, she is foreign to the culture she finds herself in, both British and Jewish Palestine. And she is given, very much given, to passionate devotion to various causes. She has kind of a history of enthusiasms and hobbies. And she has a rather facile understanding, I think, and I'd like to know what you think, of this very complex political situation. Do you agree that that's so?
Well,
are you making a comment also on, on an American finding herself in this situation?
Yeah, I think that the person who I had at the back of my mind when I was creating Joyce Bloomberg was actually a contemporary figure, was actually Laurie Berenson, the young Jewish woman who got involved, not with the Shining Path guerrillas, but with a radical group in Peru and is now in prison, or perhaps she didn't get involved. I mean, that's up in the air, but she's certainly in jail. Or somebody like her. And what I was thinking about was what happens when, what is it that leads people to get involved in causes that are somehow, on the face of it, not really their own? You know, and we're all familiar with this aspect in our lives. I mean, everybody, you know, on a benign level, everybody knows the experience of arriving in a city, you know, like Paris or Rome, and thinking, oh, I should have been born here. This is the place that, you know, of my soul, and why aren't I French? And I want to live in Paris all my life. You know, so that, you know, it's just a mistake that I was born, you know, in, I don't know, New Rochelle. You know, I should have, it's a terrible error. But when it takes on a political situation, it becomes something quite different, and we're all familiar with that too, of people who become engaged, interested in a culture, engaged in the politics, you know, go to college, get completely involved in Cuba, let's say, you know, whatever. And so I was interested in what are the ramifications, what happens when somebody, in my case, a young woman, gets involved in the early part of the century with Zionism. And she is, as you say, something of a chameleon. She's an enthusiast. She's tried art, she's tried dance. And then in London, she starts going to meetings in Toynbee Hall. And she gets involved with the romance of Zionism. And that leads her into dangerous places
which we'll talk about
in the novel. Yeah. But that's where she came from.
Well, the Bloombergs have just arrived in Jerusalem. They're there, this is their first night, when they open their door and a body of a man dressed in Arab garb lands at their feet. And the case is investigated by Robert Kirsch, this 24-year-old Jewish police detective. So that's how the novel opens. Bloomberg, after some time, allows himself to be seduced by the British High Commissioner, who is named Sir Gerald Ross,
right,
into giving up the Zionist project and going off to paint this large-scale work at Petra. That is, he leaves the Jewish cause, which was never his cause to begin with, really, and signs on with the colonial one. Now, I know that you have a personal interest in art, and so I'm curious to know if you were somehow commenting on the relationship between art and politics or art and history. Also because Sir Gerald Ross is very interested in Bloomberg's arrival because he has this pet project of restoration of antiquities in Palestine. I sense perhaps some irony there on your part. Can you talk about that?
Well, you know, perhaps this is the point to say that this novel is based on actual historical events, and that the figures are have behind them the ghosts of real people. Mark Bloomberg, the painter in my novel, is based on an actual painter, David Bomberg, a British painter, who did go out to Palestine in 1924, exactly for the reasons that you describe, and was taken up by the then governor of Jerusalem, Sir Ronald Storrs, and sent to Petra by him. So I had been interested in Bomberg for a while. I mean, quite clearly, as you bring Joyce up and Bomberg, I mean, it's you know, without sort of, you know, psyching myself out too much, you know, because I pay someone to do that 4 days a week, so there's no point in my doing it. But clearly, you know, issues to do with British, Jewish, and American identity, you know, interests me because I have that sort of mixed identity myself. Although I've noted recently that no matter how long I am in America, which is more than half my life now, that while you can be any kind of hyphenated American, Irish American, Cuban American. You cannot be an English American. Even though I want to be, but I can't be. You're English. It's like there's nothing I can do about it. I've been here more than half my life. I'm an American citizen. Forget it. You're not American. I don't think there's another identity like that. But anyway, so Bomberg. The other thing is that it so happens that my oldest brother actually owns a painting by David Bomberg that he bought very cheaply many, many years ago when Bomberg's reputation was in decline. He's since advanced and is now seen really as one of the most important British painters of the early 20th century, and on into the mid-century, and his work is in the Tate Gallery and so on. Very influential teacher as well. So I was perhaps, I was drawn to him. I should say that the murder too is based on an actual event, an actual murder that occurred in Jerusalem in 1924. Bomberg had nothing to do with that murder. He did not find the body of the murder victim, but in my novel he does. So I did some messing around there. So I think rather than there is an irony in there's a complexity in the fact that he gets sent out there to do a Zionist commission that he has no interest in. He's offered more money to provide conservative renditions of the Christian sites that he also really has little interest in. And it's only when he has hit rock bottom that he can really begin to start to paint, I think.
Are you making a comment on the relationship between art and politics? Because Bloomberg is completely, really apolitical.
Perhaps only in the sense that what interests me is, as a novelist, as I said earlier, is the way in which individuals who have limited political interest nevertheless find themselves in situations, particularly in the Middle East, where politics grabs them by the throat and pushes them this way and that. And while they may wish to carry on, I mean, I always think one of the difficult and sad things, which I try to address really in my first book of stories, Shum, which is but more light, more comic stories in some way, is that Israel, contemporary Israel, is a place where, people still go to the dentist, or worry about what they're going to put in their kids' sandwiches for lunch or something. I'm sure that's true, on the Palestinian side as well. But we lose that. We lose the dailiness of those lives because we're so invested in the politics. So as a novelist, I don't want to make a political point, not overtly anyway. And I'm interested in how individuals, how characters are affected by things that maybe they're not even, they haven't set out for, they haven't bargained for, but it gets them.
But from the point of view of the man who, after all, is in charge of governing this area, isn't there something just a little bit distasteful about, concentrating so on art when you're really sitting on a tinderbox?
Oh, you mean Sir Gerald Ross?
Right.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to give him a kind of aristocratic British nonchalance.
Right.
And that nonchalance, he does, I hope it's not too masterpiece theatre-like, but he does his stuff in an aristocratic, nonchalant way. But one of the other things is that it's actually quite fascinating, because if you actually read Sir Ronald Storr's memoirs of his time in Jerusalem, I mean, he is the the epitome of the colonial guy in charge, But at the same time, there are some rather affecting passages about, his relationship with Bialik and how much he admires Bialik's poetry. And, he has a genuine interest in the art and culture of the place. And of course, he was accused of Christianizing the city. On the other hand, many of the building bylaws that are in place in Jerusalem today come from the British, not from the Israelis. The limestone stuff, the height of buildings was all established by the British. Some of the stuff is fascinating. One of the things that happens in the novel is that a movie is being shot in Jerusalem, a movie of Titus that an American film company have come to do, which actually happened. I mean, it was just a hard thing for us to imagine that it actually came out from Hollywood and to make a silent movie. And one of the ironies was that they shot. They took the British. This is the real irony, I guess. They took the British Army, the British soldiers, the colonial soldiers, and they had them play the parts of the Imperial Roman army, they dressed them up, assaulting the walls of Jerusalem that were not actually there at the time that Titus was, but never mind that. There's a lovely description in Storrs' book of, which I have in the novel, which I sort of fictionalized, of a Bedouin charge that the Fox Film Corporation that they organized, and they gave the Bedouin lances and swords and dressed them up, and they said, okay, charge, and they just charged off, because they had the stuff. It's like, we got the lance, bye-bye, so he was somehow genuinely involved, I think in both ways.
So that you can respect him. You're not.
He's not a.
You're not just scoffing at his.
No, I don't think so. Storrs was and Ross in my novel is I think a complex figure, and also not in a particularly easy situation.
Right. Well, Bloomberg's departure to Petra allows Kirsch to fall in love with Joyce, and Joyce herself to get involved running guns for the Zionists. And now this is a project that is sponsored by the American filmmaker that you just mentioned.
Frumkin.
Pardon, Frumkin. So why is he an American?
Who else makes movies in 1924? In 1924,
right.
I don't know. That's an interesting question. One of the things that happens when you write a novel is that you get emails from people, asking questions precisely like that. And I got one, this Frumkin email, I got one that said, I have two questions for you. One is, you have a scene in Jerusalem on a Friday night, and it's a Shabbat, and you have Dr. Bassan and his wife, and Dr. Bassan carves the chicken, and I want to tell you that you've got it completely wrong, that you say they're Litvaks, and that there's no way that he would be carving the chicken. His wife would have carved the chicken. And like an idiot, I replied, I said, well, you may be right 90% of the time, but this is my novel, and in my novel, he's carving the chicken. And he's a surgeon, he likes to use his knife, and he's carving the chicken. So the guy backed off on the chicken, I'm coming to Frumkin, and then he said, okay, forget the chicken, let's move on to Peter Frumkin, your character. No Jews were called Peter in 1924. Even if his name had been Pinchas, he would have changed it to Philip, not Peter.
Well,
so
that's
I didn't reply to that one. You know, I thought, all right, you want, maybe, but he's going to Peter in my novel. You know, it's like his mother, you know, had an aberration. She called him Peter. It was like, so the answer is I don't know. He seemed right that he was an American.
But I thought that you were paying tribute to this American man of action. I thought that you, as a Brit, you know, would be wanting to say something to America here.
No, it was, no, I think he's one of the nastiest characters in the book. No, I mean, really it was more that, you know, I was basing it on an actual event, which was this movie company, Fox Film Corporation, was out in Jerusalem in 1924, so I assumed, when I fictionalized it, I gave them an American producer.
Okay. So the corpse in question here in this investigation is that of an ultra-Orthodox Jew, Jacob de Groot, who is an outspoken activist against the Zionist enterprise. And suspicion falls, although erroneously, on this young Arab boy who it turns out was de Groot's lover. Mm-hmm. Now, hardly a conventional portrait of a Mea Shearim Hasid.
Right.
So can we call you on that if we can't call you on that?
Well, I don't think I say he lives in Mea Shearim.
No,
he lives somewhere else.
That's true.
And again, you know, I have to confess, you know, here my complete failure of imagination, because the de Groot is based on someone called Yaakov Dahan, and the case is quite well known in Israel, though not so well known here. Dahan was an interesting, fascinating case. Fascinating man who had come out he was a poet in Holland, secular, and had come out to Jerusalem as a secular, I don't know if he was a Zionist, but as a secular Jew, a poet, and he had gone over to the Orthodox side and become a very successful lobbyist against the British, lobbying against a Zionist state for the Agudat Yisrael, which of course was anti-Zionist. And he was a compelling figure, and in Holland, his murder is regarded, oddly enough, as a gay murder. And part of the reason for this is that when he was murdered, it was put about that he had had gay relationships with young Arab boys, and which may or may not have been so, and I think probably maybe was, and that the murder was somehow a family taking revenge. And in real life, Dahan's actual murderers were not discovered for 50 years until a confession was made on Israel radio by people who were involved in it. So again, although in my novel, of course, you know, without giving away too much, but again, I was not straying too far in my portrait of Dahan as a gay ultra-Orthodox Jew, and believe me, they're a gay. If you've seen that astonishing movie, Trembling Before God, and documentary. So I wasn't straying. I know it seems like an odd portrait, but
well, I think for the period as well. I mean,
for the period, but it was. But maybe we tend to think too conservatively about what life was like in that period, and actually, you know, it was as strange as it is now. I think.
I think most of us have read the book, but I remained confused about who perpetrated the murder and about de Groot's 10 Downing Street connections. Could you help me?
Yeah, I think so. Well, you know, he's whether the letters ever get through to 10 Downing Street, we don't know. But de Groot seems to know something about the gun running, and he's warning them. He's telling them, he wants to warn them about a possible insurgency or building up of arms. For the actual culprit, I think, is quite clear in the novel. Yeah, I mean, it's not the Arab boy.
I know, but
Right.
if it was, because my sense was that the Zionists were sort of resentful of his going over to the Orthodox side, and as if that was the motivation for killing him, and that.
Well, let me answer it in this way. I mean, for me, one of the inspirations for this novel, when I started thinking about it, was actually after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. And I was thinking about, if you remember at the time, there was a lot of discussion in the Jewish community about the singularity or the supposed singularity of that event. How Jews would have to rethink themselves because of this thing that had happened, a Jew politically assassinating another Jew, and somehow this wasn't something that Jews did to one another. And of course, the history of Zionism is much darker than that, and darker perhaps than we would want it to be. And I began thinking about the Dehaan case, and maybe without referring to the novel, I can certainly, the Dehaan case is, you know, a historical event, and was a case of where the incipient Haganah politically assassinated somebody who they thought was having too much influence on the British government, telling them that lots of Jews don't want a Zionist state here. And they fessed up on, two of the policemen who had been involved in the cover-up confessed on Israel radio in the early 1970s. And actually, you know, maybe in some sense, this is the only good news that one can draw from it. It was men who came on the radio and said, not only was it a terrible thing that we did this, but we shouldn't have, there should have been some other way of dealing with Jews who were radically in politically divergent positions other than assassinating them.
You have Ross saying, and I quote, "De Groot and his people have the Zionists down as dangerous blasphemers defiling the Holy Land." So, you know, that's how the explanation for the tension between the Zionists and the Orthodox, the Agudat Yisrael movement.
Through an irony, of course, now the mayor of Jerusalem is from the Agudat Yisrael.
So, yeah, I mean, the novel in no way ignores the tension between Jews and Arabs, but it really points to the tension between Jew and Jew.
Yes.
Right, right. I'd like to come back to Sir Gerald Ross for a moment.
You like him?
I like him. Yeah. I like him. Find him very interesting.
Rafe Fiennes, do you think? Okay. All right, we won't go there. Okay.
I like that the way you depict a kind of an undercurrent of British anti-Semitism. I mean, he tries very hard. He doesn't let his subordinate make some sort of a slur, I think, early in the novel. I read that. Right. He doesn't permit that, but on the other hand, he's very conscious of Jews being Jews. And, you know, there's an interesting conversation, not with him, but later on in the novel, there's a young British Jew who's a tourist. And this is a conversation between Kirsch and this young man. Kirsch says, Home's England, isn't it? It is for me, Gaber said, although I sometimes think, he added, ruefully, that the reason so many Englishmen like to take a turn at running the colonies is that we're in England. They're running away from Jews, you mean? Well, not only us, there are other pariahs, but we are a part of it. Out in India or even here, they can play all the old pre-war games, ornament themselves with plumed helmets, and pretend that nothing has changed. It's not the foreign peoples whom they despise, especially if they come with a title attached, the Prince of Bangalore or the Nawab of Patudi. No, it's the foreigners in the England they've left behind. People like you and me who've made it up the ladder. People they didn't want to see on the ladder in the first place, let alone climbing it. But here, answers Kirsch, half the colonial staff is Jewish. Samuels, Bentwich, Kirsch. Kirsch laughed. Yes, Gaber added, it's a tricky one. Satraps and riffraff, all Jews. That's a recipe for trouble, don't you think? Is this an attitude based on your personal experience in England?
Yes. And I think it's historically accurate, but at the same time, maybe my own experience is distorted. In the sense, I have two older brothers, and I think that their apprehension, and they live in England, and I think that their apprehension of their lives as English Jews is very, very different from mine. And their experience was somehow different from mine, and their sense of them, the problems were different from mine. But certainly, if you're asking me if I think if the novel is informed by my own sense of what it was to be a Jew in England when I was growing up there, yes, I think it is. And that I think that the ambiguities and confusions are things that I inevitably creep into my novel. I felt that Jewishness was always primary, and that in England, and that it came into every conversation and frequently arose in a kind of grotesque form. And I felt that all through my schooling and at university. But let me qualify that in some way. There was a fascinating survey done by the historian Bernard Wasserstein many years ago when he was at Oxford, and he asked students at Oxford if they felt that Oxford was anti-Semitic, and something like 98% said yes. Then he asked them if they'd ever experienced an anti-Semitic incident while they'd been at Oxford, and 98% said no. So where did it come from? So it came, and I think the answer came. I was talking to someone else who'd also been there with me, and I was talking to them about this, and I said, well, what is this? How do you explain this? And they said they thought it was the overwhelming Christianness of the place, that, you know, the beautiful chapels, the evensong, that it's an atmosphere rather than something. And small things, you know, like you'd go for, you know, somebody would say, well, I went to see my tutor and, you know, told him I wanted to be a journalist, and he said, well, why don't you apply to the Jewish Chronicle, you know, something. Well, that's very little thing. But it's very, very different now, of course, by the way.
But the underlying assumption here is that you are always the other, isn't that?
Yes.
Isn't that the problem?
Yes, yes. I felt that. But then my brother Jeffrey just got the OBE in the Queen's New Year's Honours List, so go figure, you know. I don't quite know what to make of it. But yeah, yeah, close. That's the next one up, I think, yeah. I think that that's true. I certainly felt, and I still feel, that you can't really be English and Jewish. But other people don't feel like that. You know, it was something maybe specific to me. You know, I never felt, for example, that you could be in the mainstream of British life. But maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I've begun to think maybe I got it all wrong. I don't know.
Although you can be American and Jewish.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So what do you think accounts for the difference?
Numbers.
I mean, this is...
Certainly numbers to begin with, and the confidence that comes with numbers, and the feeling that in America you can be Jewish and let's say, you know, when there's a great explosion of great Jewish writing in the 60s, Bellow and Roth and Grace Paley and Malamud, they were greeted as great American writers, not just as great Jewish writers. I never felt in England that there's that without effacing your Jewishness almost entirely, like, say, Harold Pinter, that you can escape from the subgenre of being, let's say, a Jewish writer. That in American culture, Jewish culture is an integrated and celebrated part of that culture. It's not. It's a minority culture that's a celebrated part of the majority culture. Look at Seinfeld.
I have to take exception to that. I think that's totally due to the time we're in today. I think it's very much a result of what's in the last 30 years, possibly. And I would suspect that English culture has very much changed. It's no longer racist and class. It's not as racist and class conscious as it was, and therefore Jews are probably more part of things than they were back when you were growing up. And American Jews are now much more part of the society than they ever were. I mean, in the 50s there were still quotas on Jewish students entering Columbia.
Yeah,
so
no, absolutely. No, I'm not talking about. But you have to. There's a huge difference between a country that has a population of 6 million Jews and their sense of confidence and their clout. I'm not saying that England is a place where Jews can't make it, as judges in exactly the same way that they do in America. I think I'm talking about a very specific quality in maybe in art, a feeling that that if you are a Jewish writer, like, say, Howard Jacobson in England or Clive Sinclair, that there's a step on the ladder beyond which you can go no further. Whereas in America, you can.
Although, if I could just go back to what you said before about Bellow and Malamud and Roth and so on. I mean, there was always the question of whether they were, in fact, Jewish American writers or American Jewish writers. I mean, people love to play with these notions.
It's not. Yeah, and it's kind of not an interesting question in some way. I mean, what was interesting is the way that different writers at different times relate to that. I think, in the sense that it was quite popular at that time. If you see those interviews where they're saying we want to be seen as American writers. Now, to celebrate your ethnicity is the hot and sexy thing to do. The except if you're Jewish, which is the multicultural, to attach the hyphen is good news. So you don't find. So I think it's interesting in those terms of how the culture shifts its relation to that sort of, we don't really want a pluribus unum anymore.
Now, of course, Britain, may be different from the rest of Europe, but I wonder whether you think that the anti-Jewish sentiments that are being expressed in Europe are a real threat.
Well, I'm just a novelist. I think that again, it's a question of numbers. The European Jewish community is shrinking. I went some years ago to do a piece about Jews in Ireland for the New Yorker magazine that Tina Brown bought and never published. And after all that work. And, Ireland will actually be the first country in Europe to entirely lose its Jewish population. There are only 900 Jews left there. There were never a lot. There were. I have an Irish aunt. There were 5,000 at maximum. But it's interesting because Ireland was always also the only country in Europe where no Jew has ever been killed in any kind of anti-Semitic act. They're reduced to 900, almost all of whom are over 60. But when I grew up in England, there were 450,000 Jews. There's 250,000 now. You know? So it's a shrinking population, and I think that Europe is powerfully, as we all know, virulently anti-Israel. In England, for example, incredibly powerful forces on the left aligned against Israel, and that's spilled over, of course, into relations with the Jewish community.
I don't know if that's so different in the United States. What we have is a very large country. So if we look at areas of major population centers in New York and California and whatever, but then if we look at Arkansas or you have very small Jewish populations, and I imagine that some of these problems there may mirror some of the problems in.
Yeah. Although on the other hand, there was, you had the Lieberman phenomenon, where it turned out it wasn't really that big a deal. He was Jewish. But also now I noticed that the leader of the Tory party in England is Jewish. Now that, and they were traditionally Labour, of course. Now, actually, last time I was there, I asked someone, so does this mean there could be a Jewish prime minister in England?
Well, Jews, but not Disraeli-type Jews.
He's,
I mean,
Disraeli converted.
Right, but
Right.
you're talking about Jews who identify as Jews.
This is a guy who's came over. His parents were refugees from Nazi Europe. I forgot. I'm blanking on his name. Shamefully. I don't know. But he's self-declared.
Yes.
Self-declared Jew.
After he was
Yeah.
challenged that he was Jewish.
Yeah.
Let's.
I have just two questions and one on that. One is that I understand exactly what you were in Newark, Delaware, just a few years ago, where the community is based on church and community. And as a Jew, you were made to feel conscious of being a Jew. It may not be anti-Semitic, but here, when we lived in New York, school was closed and you never had to think about Rosh Hashanah and the high holidays. But there, you have class pictures taken on Rosh Hashanah, and the makeup day was Yom Kippur. So it's a self-consciousness of what the population is and not the time, because this was just a few years ago in a
Right.
college town
Yeah,
in Delaware. So I understand. My question to you was, when I read Joyce, would I, as a reader, read her differently if I wasn't a Jew? Because here I'm reading a Jew, seeing a non-Jew taking the cause of Zionism at the time and rooting for her, as opposed to disliking her husband, who was a Jew, for not taking the cause. Would I read people differently if I wasn't Jewish? Is that meant to
Well, Jewish people frequently like people who aren't Jewish and can't stand people who are Jewish. That's it's not uncommon because you're human. I don't know. I hope that that's a good question, because I hope that one responds to the nuance of character. She's a person who tries to, at the end, I think, to redeem herself in a very Christian way, actually, through taking on a kind of unnecessary suffering onto herself. But I don't know. I'll try in the next novel to switch it around for you, and we'll see what happens.
Sir.
Yes, Mr. Wilson, I'd like to draw on your knowledge. I lived in England as a child. I don't remember much of it, but I'd like to ask you about anti-Semitism during the war, especially in the British military. We had anti-Semitism here in our own military, and the case seems to be very similar, although I think there are some differences. I know, for example, the Jews were treated pretty decently during the Blitz. And of course, we know that there were children, refugees that came to England. But I'd like to ask you specifically about wartime and post-wartime anti-Semitism in England as compared to that, say, in America.
I'm not a historian, and it's a huge question, but there is a wonderful book called Britain and the Jews of Europe, also by Bernard Wasserstein, that deals very directly with these things, with a kind of sort of anti-Semitism that did, of course, there was anti-Semitism, but on the other hand, I had an uncle, my Uncle Harold, who was a captain in the British Army and who fought at Monte Cassino, and he never reported any experience to me of experience. I mean, of course, I'm sure there were incidents, but I don't believe that this was. I don't know how widespread, how not widespread. I mean, one of the sort of great ironies when one discusses British anti-Semitism is, of course, easy to forget that the British were the only people fighting the Nazis for a very long time. So. And I tried to deal with that in some ways in my first novel, in The Hiding Room, those confusions. I mean, there's anti-Semitism. The question, I mean, there's never going to be a world without anti-Semitism. It's not going to go away. The question is what kind of levels of. But yes, there are many incidents. I'm sure.
Well, let's return just for a little bit to the novel.
Yeah, good. Okay.
So Bloomberg returns from Petra, and he is transformed. He dedicates himself to securing Joyce's freedom from prison. He comes to accept the fact that other artists may have gotten better reviews than his. He wants to repair his marriage and work on his career. But he makes this self-discovery rather late. He makes it on the ferry ride to Cyprus, but he dies during this ferry ride. And there's this symbolic passage, and I rather like this sentence. Shortly after midnight, a slow clanging of bells announced that the boat was steaming cautiously through the narrow pass into Famagusta. So why did you feel that you had to kill the poor man off?
People die. Well, that really was one of those things that I actually wasn't planning. I tend to write quite organically, with some sort of vague idea about what's going to happen. And I had planned in that chapter to have
Of course.
I had no warning. Well, there had been a few in the novel because he'd had some shoulder pains that I'd attached to his lumping of a bag around. So I sensed that something was coming. But the truth is I somehow, at that point, I did suddenly see the ending of the novel differently from what I had planned. And I thought, no, he's not going to make it to see Rossi's going to die now. He did.
But you can't tell us why.
Well, he needed to die because my imagination wanted him to at that point. There's, it would be crass of me to say, he needed to die. Well, he needed to die so that the novel could then unravel in the way that I wanted it to. That's why characters die.
And Kirsch returns to England with a young wife, and I'm wondering what he and she will encounter in British society and why he goes back. I mean, he really had no attachment to Palestine. But she seems to, or at least, she seems to really take to, from a social point of view, from a kibbutz point of view, she's a nurse, I think,
yes.
And she really seems to take to everything that Palestine represents at this stage.
Yes, she's an immigrant from
Russia.
What happens to them afterwards as someone else's novel, I don't know. I don't even know that they get on the boat. You know, they're planning to go, and she says, if I don't like it, can we come back? And he doesn't reply, and he's also, I think it's not clear at the end exactly what his relationship with Joyce still is. She says to him at the end, was she the love of your life? And he says, no, you were. No, you are. But whether we believe him or not is...
Right. I
and
thought
whether
there was
she
a little
believes
path,
him or
really,
not.
on his part. Not on your part, on his part.
Well, he's lying, I guess.
Right.
Yeah.
So, you know, one of the things that I really liked about your novel is this cinematic approach, because you have shifting scenes, right? We move from one character and his dilemma or problem or situation to another, and it occurs to me that it would make a marvelous movie.
Great. Make some calls.
I don't know anyone.
Yeah. Well, I have a nephew. Actually, it's an interesting story. My first novel, The Hiding Room, came very, very close to being made into a movie. And it was optioned by a company called Starfield Productions in England. And they had, my agent called me up in England, who I no longer have, and said, well, you know, Starfield optioned it, and it's all got to be, but the funding is coming from Film 4, which is Channel 4 Films, which was one of the big British film companies, and it's all got to be authorized by this guy called Jim Wilson. And I said, well, that'll be all right, it's my nephew, you know, I'll call him up. So I called my nephew and I said, hey, James, you know, my novel's about to come across your desk. And he said, we're already doing 2 World War II movies. You know? And I said, who took you to see Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory when you were 4? Don't give me the shit about we're already doing 2 World War II. He goes, all right, Uncle, I'll see what I can do. You know, put the very louche London lad, you know. And sure enough, it kind of happened. And Freddie Raphael, who wrote Eyes Wide Shut, but who some of you here may remember also wrote Darling, if you remember that lovely movie with Julie Christie. He wrote the screenplay, which was a nightmare for me to read. I wish I hadn't read it, you know. It was like sort of Lawrence of Arabia meets Exodus, you know. People who died in my novel were all alive dancing a horror at the end of the movie. A ship sank at the beginning that wasn't even in my novel, and I think that used up the whole budget for the film that was going to be. And Stephen Daldry, who did The Hours, was supposed to direct it, and Jennifer Connelly was going to play the lead, Esther, and everything was going along very nicely. And I was thinking, well, you know, is it going to be Laurel Canyon, you know, or Bel Air that I rent the house in for 6 months? And then 9/11 happened, and they were going to shoot this film in Morocco, and after that they couldn't get the insurance, and the whole thing fell apart. Now with this one, a number of people have talked about the cinematic qualities, and I actually had a discussion with my nephew about it, who no longer works for Film 4, because I think he ran them into the ground. They no longer exist. They don't exist. He's busy making The Lovely Bones now. You know, that's what his project. And I said, so what's, you know, what about the novel? He said, well, first of all, you know, if you're outside the movie world, it looks like an appealing novel. From inside it, it's a nightmare, because it's historical, which is apparently almost inevitably doomed to lose money because they cost so much money to make. Secondly, it's about Palestinians and Jews. Nobody wants to touch that. Forget it, you know. So maybe if I could remake it as a contemporary novel, not about Palestinians and Jews, it would be a green light, go, you know, but maybe the next book. But, you know, it would certainly be very nice, but I've stopped dreaming about the movies. So maybe the book coming out next year.
So tell us, I know that you're a Bellow scholar from way back, but tell us about something about what writers have influenced you, and whom are you reading these days?
Well, I actually just wrote a piece for an anthology that Schocken is doing about becoming a Jewish writer, I think. And I wrote an essay, and it began with a story. I remember, I think it must have been like 1969, maybe a little earlier. And I was having a big argument with my mother about Portnoy's complaint, you know. And my mother was saying, I hate that book. I hate that Philip Roth. I hate him. He's disgusting. It's a horrible book. And we'd gone back and forth about it for a while. She just kept saying she hated it. And the only, the most pathetic thing on my side, my, crowning victorious moment was I said to her, but you haven't read it. And, as if that would make a difference, as if some basic thing like that, And she said, I don't need to read it to know how horrible it is and how horrible it is. But Philip Roth really opened the door for me in my imagination, because I felt like, wow, if I'd had a tape recorder on in my house, okay, the accents were different, but the stuff was the same, the stuff was the same. And it was just a revelation. And so for me, I guess for me, that was maybe this is, where this comes from, that for me, Bellow and Roth and Malamud were so important to me as, to see these writers as a young man growing up in England. And it just seemed to me that there was nothing in England like it, and it was, so that was revelatory for me. But in terms of the actual influence on my writing, I write, I'm a little skitsy. I write historical novels and contemporary books of stories. And I think in my stories, the two writers who've influenced me the most are Grace Paley, who I just admire beyond all others for her wit and economy and brilliance. I would love to write one story as good as her. Grace Paley and Isaac Babel, I think, for the language. And in terms of my novels, I don't know why I write these novels the way that I do, but I don't feel any. Maybe Graham Greene. I think, yeah, Graham Greene. In terms of what I've been reading, I'm just all over the place. The book I loved last year was Alexandra Fuller's Don't Let's Go to the Dogs Tonight, memoir about growing up in Zimbabwe. I thought it was absolutely brilliant. And another book I love was the New York Review of Books. They have this little paperback series, and they reissued a novel by Darcy O'Brien called A Way of Life Like Any Other. Very short novel about growing up in Hollywood in the 40s. It's just exquisite, funny, brilliant, beautiful book. And on the way down on the train, because I can't remember anything else I've read, I was reading a book by Georges Simenon, 3 Bedrooms, that I liked a lot.
Do you read detective stories?
I don't read detective stories. I hate them, no. This is his only book that isn't a detective story. No, I don't read them. And then just 2 days ago, I read a book by a young Israeli writer called Oz Shalach, called Picnic Grounds, that was a New Directions published. I mean, he's very, very, way out radical lefty, but he's a terrific writer. It was a haunting novel. But I could talk about that for a long time.
Okay.
Books read and.
What's in the offing? What's coming down the pike, as they say? I know you're writing something for Jonathan Rosen's series. He mentioned it the last time we met.
I'm a little late.
Well, he said, in fact, if you recall, my friends,
one of the people who works for the publishers in the audience. So, yes, go ahead.
No,
Sorry,
he told
I'm sorry.
us that we are to ask you why you're late.
Did he?
He did, didn't he? Am I lying? No.
Yeah, it's because he's not paying me.
So tell us what you're doing for him and what you're writing in general.
I have a book of short stories that is done called An Ambulance is on the Way, Stories of Men in Trouble. And that will be out in the spring of 2005 from Pantheon. And I am writing the book for Jonathan Rosen about, in the Jewish Life series, about Chagall. I have many excuses. I'm having lunch with him tomorrow, and I've been lining them up in my mind. Not with Chagall, no, but with Jonathan
Shame, I was going to ask if I could
with Jonathan Rosen. I didn't know I was going to be tortured here. Let me think. Why am I late? Everybody's late. Nobody's finished. Only Sherwin Newland came in on time.
I see.
And he was doing Maimonides. So that was an easy one, It's like, I could have done that. Chagall's complex. He lived till, almost 100 years. It's a lot of... Had to look at all the paintings, That was...
That'll take you a while.
I need to go to France. There are many reasons.
Well, I see hands. There are a lot of people who want to talk to you.
Sure.
You mentioned that you lived in Israel for a while.
I did, yeah.
What took you to Israel, and what did you do there, and how did it affect you?
I came here in 1976 on the night before the bicentennial to New York, and I didn't go out because I thought people were shooting each other. I'd never been to America before, and people had warned me, but it turned out it was just firecrackers. I was literally scared out of my mind. I thought they were shooting on the streets, as I'd heard. Anyway, I came here I was a grad student in Oxford, and I had met there the poet T. Carmi, who was working on the anthology of Hebrew poetry, and I worked with him a little, some small assistance, very small. And I had come to the States with a grant from England to study for a semester at Columbia. Not to actually go to any classes. I didn't do that. I just went to the library. I didn't do that. I went to the Gold Rail, which was a bar, and a bar called the West End, and tried to pick up girls. That's what. I loved New York. I'd never seen Jewish people having so much fun in my life, and I loved it. And I didn't want to leave. And then somebody, my friend Kami, called me up and said there's a job going at Hebrew University. And in those years, Protexia was still very much in operation. You didn't actually apply for jobs in Israel. People just made a number of phone calls on your behalf, and you showed up and they interviewed you or something like that. I never saw it. Anyway, so I showed up and I was interviewed, and I got a job teaching in the English department in Hebrew University. So that's what I did for 4 years. I lived in Jerusalem. And then I met my wife, who was American there. She's a painter, and she was teaching in Betzalel, and she'd been there a couple of years when we met. And then at the end of those 4 years, I came back here.
Yes.
When I was done with your novel, I found myself wondering about Joyce and her punishment.
And it didn't seem to me like she didn't reveal Peter Frumkin's name because she felt so badly about what she did. It was almost as if what she felt bad about was that she was a dilettante. She felt bad that she'd hurt Kirsch's feelings, that she didn't take care of Kirsch. But it didn't seem like she really felt all that badly about her gun running. You know? Again,
Well,
she's punishing herself for just being such a non-committal person.
I don't think so. I'm sorry if that's what you extrapolated, because I wanted her sort of fall into silence, and at least in a couple of chapters, to suggest that she had reached some, deeper place in her soul, and that she was deeply sorry for having for the results of her dilettantism, her chameleon-like behavior, and that she felt that she should suffer for the damage that she had done, or potentially done, or was still going to have ramifications. So maybe I didn't make it clear enough, but yeah.
I never knew this DeHaan fellow, so this is interesting to me. Did the government, as a successor to Haganah, ever make a statement following the confessions on rape?
I don't know, but there was a lot of certainly a lot of press about it. If you read there's a short piece about it in Martin Gilbert's book about Jerusalem, where he has a couple of paragraphs on the DeHaan Affair and its aftermath. I don't think the government ever, apologized. I mean, it was simply that these two policemen who had been involved in the cover-up went on the radio and confessed.
As part of a talk show, or as part of what?
As part of a news item, I think, they decided to come forward, say we did this.
Yes.
Well, when I read the book, I had more a sense that it was about what Israel could have been, that you had all these kind of different things, different groups there, and that none of them really could get along, and that you were showing kind of the seeds of the problem.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that I certainly did want to say the seeds of a great deal that that we need to look further back, and if you look further back, you can see the seeds of the problems. And I think one of the characters says at one point, can something that goes wrong at the beginning ever be put right again? And of course that's all, he's talking, I think, though, about a love affair, but it's also, I think, the question that the book wants to pose in some way.
What do you think was wrong there? What happened, in the book?
There's a lovely thing that Chekhov says about Anna Karenina, and I'm not comparing myself to Tolstoy. And he says that Anna Karenina succeeds absolutely as a novel. He says not a single problem is solved in Anna Karenina, but it succeeds perfectly as a novel because all the problems are correctly stated. And that would be something that, as a novelist, is what I would aspire toward. That not to offer a solution, but simply to.
What problem do you think you
Well, clearly there are problems of, people being displaced, two peoples fighting over the same piece of land, a colonial authority that is attempting to be impartial while actually imposing its own agenda in a variety of ways. The problems that I think we all know that have become so manifest now. Are there at the beginning, but they're in a more fluid way. I mean, you do have this strange thing of the thing that I put in the novel about the football match, where there are Jewish policemen and Palestinian Arab policemen playing together. That actually took place. You've got a police force with Jews and Arabs together. I mean, it's the problems of nascent nationalisms of two groups at two different stages of their nationalism, struggling with each other at a time when colonialism itself is beginning to wind down.
And of course, the novel, there is a reflection, of course, of the things that are going on. You mentioned the football match. Well, I'm always reading in the newspaper various attempts of Arabs and Jews trying to put something together on a communal level, whether it's theater or
Right. They just climbed a mountain. There's some
did they? Oh, that I did not read
Palestinian
about.
and Jewish group that just joint, exactly as you say, joint
so
mountain.
in that sense, your novel, is a reflection of the world that we are still living in,
Yeah.
which I find very interesting.
Yeah. It's also a love story, of course.
And let's not forget that.
Right.
Jonathan Wilson, thank you so much.
Thank
It
you.
was lovely having you.
Thank you very much.
And I
Pleasure to
hope
be
you'll
here.
write some more and come again.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.